Hi, everybody. We are live now. Welcome, everybody, to our first virtual walking book club. I'm Marissa Brigitte from South Coast Almanac, and we had this planned months ago in April. We were going to feature and are going to feature Joshua Slocum's book, Sailing Alone Around the World. And we had a great walk planned around the Poverty Point section of Fairhaven, but the pandemic had other plans for us. And after many months, we decided to make this virtual. And for those of you who have been to our walking book clubs before, we're going to have some of the same things. Corey and I will be talking about the book, of course. We'll be discussing, reading some passages. And we have some photos and we have a video that we will maybe show as well. And just a couple of housekeeping things before we start. We've decided to break it into 2 sessions. One of the things we love about the Walking Book Club is that we have time for like intimate conversations as we walk from place to place. And that's a little hard. We can't do a panel and have that at the same time. So what we did is we're going to have 45 minutes here on the YouTube Live. And then for those of you who signed up, you have a Zoom link. I know some people have been sending requests for the Zoom link in the last couple of minutes. I'll get those to you at the end of the show. And then we're going to have a second breakout session in a Zoom room. So you can come back to our Zoom room and we will announce the next book for the Walking Book Club and have like smaller conversations. And depending on how many people are there, we're going to break out into smaller groups, like 4 or 5 people, and we can talk about what books we've been reading during the pandemic and things like that. So, most importantly, thank you to our sponsors, Partners Village Store in Westport and the Friends of the Millicent Library in Fairhaven. So thank you so much for supporting this quirky thing that we do and love. And I am going to introduce now our wonderful book club guru, Corey Neffer. Corey is a writer. She's an editor. She is our book club guru. She's a cultural maven. She does great walking tours, even beyond books. And we're really lucky to have her. She's also a wine expert. So many things, so many things. So anyway, Corey's going to introduce you to our 2 special guests tonight. Corey, you can take it away.
So, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your Monday night to do this nerdy, lovely thing, our little walking book club, but now virtual. When you Google Joseph Slocum, you'll pretty quickly come across some real wit out there in the internet hinterlands. And one of them is referring to him as the Don Quixote of the ocean or the seas, which I just love that idea. And when you start giving people nicknames, you start to feel kind of this intimacy with them, that they're a buddy of yours. And it just kind of rolled off the tongue that in my head, I started calling him Joe Slow. And that just felt kind of natural. Just and when you're reading the book too, there's a fluency of or fluidity of language that he uses, or at least that's how I was interpreting it. So Melissa and I were being a little silly with how we talk about him. He is our unspoken guest for tonight. And as we were thinking about this person who isn't here, as we're reading something as intimate as a memoir, Melissa and I were talking about how there seems to be this suspicious lack of information. And even right at the beginning, there seemed to be this defensiveness he had even about his own identity. And part of my background, I initially was going to go on to seminary. So my degrees are in religion and philosophy. And there's part of my training was this type of way of reading, this Jewish reading technique called midrash, midrash. And it approaches text, holy text, with this idea that the text is holy because there are holes in it. There's holes in the narrative. So as you're making your way through things, if you start to get suspicious about a lack of detail somewhere, that's a place where your feelers should be out, and you should maybe start guessing about what that omission means. If it means a deflection, if it was an accident. And I just felt myself constantly in this deceptively short memoir, finding a lot of this. And then at the same time, a lot of detail that was almost overwhelming to me. And this made it a really fun read. And it also started this momentum of questions that I had for our next guest, local author Stan Grayson. So Stan, hello.
Hello.
We have burning questions for you. We have mysteries. And one of them was, what got you to write about this person, this other local? It's one of the questions we have. The list is long, Stan.
Good. Well, I'm not local to the South Coast. The first time I read Slocum's book, Sailing Alone Around the World, I was actually in Vietnam, and it was somewhat of an escape, an escape literature. And I remember sitting in a bunker thinking about Slocum and what he did. And after I got back and got out of the Army and eventually learned how to sail, I began reading sailing books. And the first one that I reread was Sailing Alone Around the World. And it's a book, as you know, that it's deceptively simple. You can read it many times and always find something new. But the more I began to get into sailing and yachting and so forth, the more I realized how much Slocum had kept hidden. And this was by design, And so I wanted to find out more. There was really only one good biography of him called The Search for Captain Slocum, which I read, and was really a terrific piece of work. And I spoke with the author of that book, who happened to live in Princeton, where I lived at the time. And I said, you did such a great job. I wonder if there's more. And he assured me there was more, but it took years for me to figure out a way to dig it out, which was made possible by the internet. So that's really how I got started in this. This began in the 70s, and these questions lingered and lingered and lingered, and I knew there was no way to find answers to them. If you open Sailing Alone Around the World, you see the dedication, which is to the one who said the spray will come back. And I wondered, well, who was that? And it wasn't Slocum's wife, his second wife. So anyhow, that's how this whole thing started. And I was mystified also by a man of such intelligence that and this isn't really clear in the book, and he deliberately makes things murky. He could navigate around the world without a chronometer, and how he did it in really an ungainly kind of a boat. He was about 150 pounds, Slocum, and the mainsail on the spray had to be. He did cut it down eventually, but it must have been almost 700 square feet of canvas, and you have to be a very fit, strong guy, to raise a sail like that. If you're doing it several times a day, I mean, this is a chore. So anyhow, that's kind of the way for me to start to answer your question.
Stan, can I read a couple paragraphs from your introduction just to drive home this point for
Oh,
folks.
sure.
Maybe, and again, to drive home the point, if you haven't read the book yet, or if you read it years ago, his writing is so lush and beautiful, so strangely modern. He's got a sense of humor. His vocabulary makes nautical lexicon just come alive in a way that makes you want to care about him. Melissa and I talked at length about that, and but your introduction has got just this kind of almost brings a tear to your eye sort of situation that he was in. You write, Joshua Slocum's life was such a kaleidoscope of adventure in wild, beautiful, and dangerous places that a skilled novelist would be hard-pressed to invent anything even vaguely like it. His story combined aspects of Richard Henry Dana's 2 Years Before the Mist, Johann David Weiss's The Swiss Family Robinson, and Charles Nordhoff and James Norman Hall's Mutiny on the Bounty. Yet Slocum himself, by design, remained a mysterious man. When Forest and Stream magazine reviewed Sailing Alone Around the World in 1900, the writer noted with some disappointment how little, quote, of his own personal life the sailor author had to say. But that was how Slocum wanted it. Charming and outwardly welcoming to his admiring public, Joshua Slocum never was an open book. The inner man always remained hidden where Slocum wanted him, in his painful, tumultuous past that none would ever glimpse in its entirety. His personal life was largely unknown to even his children. Reflecting upon his father in 1953, Garfield Slocum, the youngest of 4 surviving children, wrote, "He was a mystery to me and will be to my dying day." So that's in your introduction. My feeler started coming out when, right at the beginning, when he's talking about how he's just decided to sail around the world by himself. And there is, the man goes in such detail about where he's from in Nova Scotia and what it means to be a Yankee, and then extreme detail about how he builds the spray. And then in one paragraph, the first sentence of this one paragraph was that he can't fish, which we learn later is a joke. The second was it's basically time to drop anchor. And then the third sentence is he's going to sail around the world. Like, there's no buildup. And immediately I was like, okay, is the man in financial trouble? Did he insult someone and has to flee? Like, what happened? And I wanted to ask you, Stan, like, and Marlissa and I haven't read Marlissa, you haven't read Stan's book yet?
No, but it's on my, I'm getting
yeah,
it. I can't wait now.
We will read it. But Stan, did you uncover the mystery of what brought him to decide to do this?
Oh yeah, I think so. And it's like everything with Slocum. It's complicated, but it's also, in this case, maybe not so complicated. First of all, the economic, he was, as I make clear, he was born too early. So he was this genius of a sailor and a captain and a navigator, and all he wanted to do was be skipper of a commercial sailing vessel. Well, by the time he really could do it, steam had taken over, and he refused to go into steam. So it was a slow financial decline for him. He lost his ship. He was shipwrecked and hit rock bottom. And he went to East Boston, where his sister-in-law lived, and Slocum kind of moved in with his wife, and tried to find work in the East Boston shipyards. And he he got a few jobs, but it was terrible. And then they petered out. And then in 1893, there was a terrible economic collapse, which economists today still look back on, but it made things even worse. And so he had really nothing going for him. And then he gets this offer: if you come to Fairhaven, I'll give you a boat from Eben Pierce, this retired whaler. And really, he had nothing better to do. And he goes down there, and the building of the boat, of course, took a year. And once the boat was built, what's he going to do with it? Well, as you mentioned, he did think about fishing, and he actually invented and patented a kind of a special fishing net. So he was kind of making fun of himself about not being able to catch fish. But it was true that it wasn't economically viable for him. And he was desperate for money. And the book talks about how he accepted this crazy deal to be in charge of an ironclad, peculiar warship that was being sent to Brazil as part of an attempt to combat a civil war. And he was going to be paid, what was for him would have been the king's ransom in money. And not only did he almost get drowned because that vessel wasn't unseaworthy, but when they finally got there, the Brazilians said, well, you can forget getting any money out of this, skipper. And he wound up going back to Massachusetts on a sailing ship, and he had less money than when he started. So really, he was sitting there, and he published a couple of books, self-published them. They didn't make any money. He didn't really have anything better to do, but he conceived this idea of sailing the Spray by himself around the world, which he saw as a way to make money. And he interested the Boston Globe. He interested a couple of newspapers in paying him, for columns he would write. And that's really it was a great idea, and it would be a great adventure. And he was just a very adventurous man, scared of nothing. And so he took off with this in mind, that he could sail around the world and write stories about it and be paid. And that's what he did. And when he was really so broke that I suspect it's true when he said that I left with $1.50 in my pocket. Now that may be like $20 today, but it wasn't much. But he knew everybody, and when people found out, these maritime folks and so forth, they'd give them, here's a cask of codfish, and here's some coffee, and Mabel Wagnalls, who's the woman to whom the book was dedicated, very, very wealthy woman, whose father owned a publishing company. Well, Mabel brought him his library. So he didn't need much cash to get this thing going. And so when he took off, he had a fully provisioned vessel. He had a library of books, and A Man for All Oceans tells about, so what some of these books are. He was, he was this guy who probably had 3 or 4 years of grade school education, but he was reading all the finest philosophers, historians, Darwin, you name it. And he was so darn smart that he could remember long passages of Shakespeare or whatever. And this sustained him in his trip. And then when his first stop, he left East Boston, and the first stop was Gloucester. And in Gloucester, guess what? Well, he's in the inner harbor, and across the harbor is this bottom paint company, and they gave him several quarts of bottom paint. He didn't even have bottom paint on the boat, so he could paint the spray and anti-fouling against worms and so forth. So he was always, people were fascinated with him. If they could afford it, they helped out.
Did word get around the world? I mean, there were definitely many ports that he entered that it felt like people were expecting him. But at the same time, there's no phones and really anything, and except these packet boats, right? And mail. And when he would arrive at certain places, like people were expecting him. And I'm wondering if along with that expectation was this, not just that it was a single man sailing by himself, but that he had no money. Like he was just he has this way of humble bragging all the time. Well, at the same time, if someone approaches him with, this amazing military garb or, someone with airs about them, he is very quick to take them down in the memoir. And usually people like that, are not good with, they're not true seamen, or they're just not very good at what they do on a boat. So it's as if I was feeling like the only real thing he has is, to kind of humble brag about what he's doing, but at the same time and about the spray and how good it is and amazing it is. And, but he's deflecting a little bit because he's in this really scary situation with no money and at the mercy of people's goodwill. And for instance, when he entered, I think, was it in Sydney or somewhere in Australia, and they charged him money, to be in port, to anchor there. Like that's one of the only few, that charged him money, and he definitely named them. Oh, you're muted, Stan.
That was in Brazil, where what happened in Brazil was the guys who he nominally would have been fighting against were now in power in the Civil War. So they didn't forget, and they charged him. They charged the spray port fees, even though he was a bad fellow in terms of hated bureaucracy, didn't like rules, but he made sure that he registered the spray at the customs house in Boston as a yacht, so that he wouldn't be charged port fees. And of course, these guys stuck it to him, and a newspaper admirer of his came to his rescue and paid so he could get the heck out of there. But you're right. He was by necessity a self-promoter, and he got better and better at it as the trip went along, so that when he'd be arriving at some port, if they didn't know he was coming beforehand, they quickly found out, and then the next thing would be that they'd arrange for one of these talks he would give with at the time they were called lantern slides, and they were a precursor to what you guys were probably old enough to remember slide projectors, but these originally they actually used an open flame to create light, and then they were electrified, and he'd give these talks, and people would pay money, and for the time, good money, so that he began accruing. He supported himself.
Cool. I did have a question about the mystery of him. Sort of the final mystery is that this guy who was such a sailor, so adept at so many things, and he went around the world, and then he's lost at sea. So do you speak to that at all in your book?
Well, the last chapter of of A Man for All Oceans is, what happened to Captain Josh.
Mm-hmm.
And again, when I started this thing, I said, well, anybody's guess is as good as another. But then it turned out, I stumbled on the fact that Edgar Rose Snow, who you may have heard of, he worked for the Quincy Patriot Ledger, but he was more a historian, and he was I guess we'd call him now, I think he was Harvard educated. We call him a folklorist, and he found all these New England legends, and he'd write them up. They were very entertaining. He was very well known, and he loved lighthouses, and he'd tell stories about lighthouses. And at some point, Snow was approached by an ex-sea captain who said, I know what happened to Captain Slocum, and he went up to the Patriot Ledger, and they had their meeting and so forth. And Snow wrote it up, and he didn't really divulge one of the key people in this. I think at the time a person was alive. What happened was, and I tend to believe this because you've heard sometimes the phrase, oh, this guy was born to be hanged because he'd never be drowned. Well, Slocum, Slocum couldn't swim a stroke. He was never going to be drowned because of a failure of seamanship. But he's sailing by himself all the time. He's sailing at night. And anyway, to very briefly set the story, he was in the Caribbean. Then he was last seen at an island called Turtle Island, where he stayed with a planter. And he was headed for the Orinoco River. He had this crazy idea of he was going to sail up the Orinoco and find a way if it connected to the Amazon. And which is kind of sad because it speaks to a terrific guy who had nothing better to do than this kind of goofy exploration. And at any rate, the story the man told to Edgar Rose Snow was that he had boarded an inter-island steamer and near Turtle Island. And when he got on this ship, he noticed there was quite a damage in the bow. And they said, well, we don't want to talk too much about this, but last night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, dark night, we ran down a native boat, and we figured it's a native boat. We didn't do anything. And the guy said, well, what time did this happen? I said, well, it happened at such and such a time. And where did it happen? Well, it happened, such and such a place. And he had, a cold chill come over him and basically felt that that was Slocum. It wasn't a native boat. And the key question, he said to the second mate of this ship, who was at the wheel at the time, he said, well, was there anybody at the helm? He said, no. He said there was nobody at the helm. Now, the Spray was renowned for this ability to say, Slocum would sleep and so forth. And so I think he was asleep in that steamship lane, got run down, and that's what happened. Mm-hmm. And it was, but of course, nobody really knew at the time. I think I'd have to look in the book. I think this may have been told to Snow in 1959 or so. So his second wife, Hetty, had no knowledge. Well, is Joshua alive? Is he dead? What do I do about what little estate there was and so forth? And it took several years for that to be settled. And even at that, it was, I began to think of Joshua Slocum as 1 year off Slocum, because every date that he gave was like 1 year off. When how old was he? He was 20 when he said he was 21. When did he get his American citizenship? And that was a year off. And sure enough, when he left Martha's Vineyard, which was the last place he was seen in the States, in 1909, by the time everything developed, it turned into, everybody was saying it was 1910, which became important to his wife in terms of, the paperwork part of it. So the mystery continued right to the end. But I tend to believe that's what happened. His oldest son, Victor, who was the only one of the four who followed the sea and became an expert navigator himself, always thought the spray was run down at night by a steamship.
Mm-hmm.
He had no proof of it, but I think that's what happened.
Well, that's more than I thought. I thought it was still just a mystery. So gave me more information than I even expected.
Oh, good.
So I just want to be mindful of time. I'm the one who keeps the trains running. And I want to make sure that we can share some pictures of the sites that you can all go and visit after this event. We're going to read some passages and get Stan's thoughts on them as well. And let me, if you want to start with a passage that you'd like to read, Corey, and I will put up some of the pictures that we have.
Yeah. So this, there are so many passages that are worthy of reading, either because they're just beautiful or they're a lot of technical information that also reads like poetry, as he's describing the wind and how the spray is moving, what steps he's taking with the sails. One theme that also comes out, though, is identity. Who Slocum saw himself as, especially when he was going to different parts of the world. And I perked up in this one passage where he was in South Africa, and he was talking about American humor and one of the best American stories he had ever heard. And I was like, what does that mean? Because a lot of things he says still ring true today. Like at one point, he's lamenting about when boys were boys, or people don't have time to talk to each other anymore. Like little things like that. And I think, oh, nothing has changed. But this one, I couldn't quite figure out. So I was excited to hear what he said. And what unfolds is this legendary sort of interaction with someone he just calls Mr. Stanley. And then he qualifies Mr. Stanley as being the great explorer who was just from Pretoria. So I Googled that and figured out that this is Henry Morton Stanley, the author and explorer who found the Scottish missionary, Dr. Livingstone. So that phrase, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, that is the Mr. Stanley that he was dining with one night. And this passage I'm about to read is not only modern and interesting, it's funny. And that is something that is hard to have a lasting sort of hilarity to it. So he says here, and this is, I won't read you the actual conversation he had with Mr. Stanley. That didn't translate so well, but this next part. And so he's in South Africa, and the South Africa at this time is run by the Boers, the Dutch. And he writes, it sounds odd to hear scholars and statesmen say the world is flat. But it is a fact that 3 Boers, favored by the opinion of President Kruger, prepared a work to support that contention. While I was at Durban They came from Pretoria to obtain data from me, and they seemed annoyed when I told them that they could not prove it by my experience. With all the, right, this is a guy who's traveling around the world with the advice to call up some ghosts from the Dark Ages for research. I went ashore and left these three wise men poring over the spray's track on a chart of the world, which, however, proved nothing for them, for it was on Mercator's projection, and behold, it was flat. The next morning, I met one of the party in a clergyman's garb, carrying a large Bible, not different from the one I had read. He tackled me, saying, "If you respect the word of God, you must admit that the world is flat." If the word of God stands on a flat world, I began. "What?" cried he, losing himself in a passion and making as if he would run me through with, and I don't know how to pronounce this, asagi, some sort of sword.
Asagi, it's the traditional spear of the natives in Africa.
Okay.
The Zulu.
Stan, I wish you were around me the whole time I read this because I was constantly going on the Google. Okay, so he says, "What?" He shouted in astonishment and rage, while I jumped aside to dodge the imaginary weapon. Had this good but misguided fanatic been armed with the real weapon, the crew of this spray, and Slocum not always, but he often refers to himself as the crew of the spray, would have died a martyr then and there. The next day, seeing him across the street, I bowed and made curves with my hands. He responded with the level swimming movement of his hands, meaning that the world is flat. A pamphlet by these Transvaal geographers, made up of arguments from sources high and low to prove their theory, was mailed to me before I sailed from Africa on my last stretch around the globe. So I just felt like this could have happened today. Even his use of the word fanatic. And then his humor that he's seeing this guy across the street and does the whole this and then that. I felt it was so modern, so funny, and so sassy. Like he was a guest there and he couldn't help himself to poke the bear about this. And I felt that most of the time he was quite respectful, but when it came to science and literature, things like that, he would bristle a bit. I don't know. What do you want to say about that passage, that scene, Stan?
Well, I would say a couple of things. First of all, that you're very perceptive, and you pick up. You must be a writer. And you pick up on the language and all this stuff. The one thing he couldn't abide, he could get along with everybody, but he could not abide pretentiousness, and he could not abide what he considered willful ignorance. And so when he ran up against these these fundamentalist Boers, he had a problem. But he, as you suggest, he dealt with it in a good humored way. There's actually a cartoon. One of the cartoons or illustrations in Sailing Alone Around the World is a cartoon of Paul Kruger, smoking his German pipe and making fun of him. And so yes, you picked up on all that. The other thing I would say, Henry Morton Stanley, in his expedition, this was like the biggest news in the world at that time. Everybody was talking about it. And so for Slocum to be having dinner with the man who found Dr. Livingstone, who had somehow survived this incredible trek across the Belgian Congo, it's typical. Slocum always washed up at the same table with the most famous people, in the world. And he knew Teddy Roosevelt, and he took Archie Roosevelt sailing, and it goes. It's just kind of amazing is how many very famous people he met. He met Mark Twain. The list goes on and on. So we shouldn't be too surprised that in South Africa he met Stanley.
Yeah.
And if I could just read a short, very, very short passage that I loved, I want to put up because we have all these slides. So this was the place where the spray was being rebuilt, this yard. And I'm just going to show you a few spaces, a few pictures. So that's the rock that is the monument to Joshua Slocum on the right. The one on the left is for John Cook, the first pilgrim in Fairhaven, or the last pilgrim, both, I suppose. And right across on the right-hand side is the water where he launched it from. So he basically just brought it across the street, which I love. And so you can go to the park and sit there on the bench and kind of like think about Joshua Slocum and his rebuilding of the spray and launching. And then the wonderful thing is that he comes back to Fairhaven. He finishes his trip, he goes to Newport, but he doesn't quite feel like it's over. So he comes back to Fairhaven because he feels like the spray has to come home. And this is a very short passage, but I just love it because he goes on this adventure. And then it's one of the last paragraphs. And he says, "Was the crew well? Was I not? I had profited in many ways by the voyage. I had even gained flesh and actually weighed a pound more than when I sailed from Boston. As for aging, why, the dial of my life was turned back till my friends all said, 'Slocum is young again.' And so I was, at least 10 years younger than the day I felled the first tree for the construction of the spray." I just loved that. He went on this adventure and he came back feeling revitalized. And that was one of my favorites of the book, just because of the nature of adventure, right? And sort of an accomplishment too.
Yeah. And I think it speaks to his optimism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the spray adventure was, by comparison to what Slocum had endured previously, the loss of his wife, his first wife, which was, they were married 13 years, and it was just one of those. This guy and this young woman were born for each other. It was a perfect match. And then she dies. He never really found his way fully again after that. Then he lost his ship, and he built a 30-foot boat and sailed back from Brazil to Massachusetts. He'd had mutinies aboard. He'd had cholera aboard one of his ships. I mean, there were real nightmares he endured. And the spray was, it was a tough trip, but it was kind of like a vacation cruise by comparison to this. But he always ended up, and after all these terrible experiences, always ended up on an optimistic, upbeat, kind of even humorous note.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Is there one more that you want to read, Corey? We are at 7:45, but we can maybe do one short one before we break for the.
Yeah, I guess because of his, he was so observant. His language was reflective of such an incredible mind. He did quote some Shakespeare while on the boat, and just all sorts of poetry. And I just kept thinking, what does, for someone who used celestial navigation and, had memorized so much, what does someone like that see when they look at the water? What is their experience? And he does such a great job at communicating that. But there was this one moment when this is when he's coming back and he's noticing the water has changed a little bit from the first half of his journey. And he says, "Strange and long forgotten current ripples patterned against the sloop's sides in grateful music. The tune arrested the oar, and I sat quietly listening to it while the spray kept on her course. By these current ripples, I was assured that she was now off to St. Roque and had struck the current which sweeps around that cape. The trade winds, we old sailors say, produce this current, which in its course from this point forward is governed by the coastline of Brazil, Guyana, Venezuela, and as some would say, by the Monroe Doctrine. And I had to put the book down a little bit because he just noticed this one little ripple. It was just like, it sounded like grateful music to him, and it arrested the oar, and he sat quietly listening to it. And he's alone, and he's going to be alone for like 42 days. And I just loved, the way he's depicting it is that he's got this, he is so good. He noticed this one little thing, and that was all the, hundreds and hundreds of miles away, and he noticed it right there. And I just, and some of it, I'm kind of like, is that a little BS? Are you that good? Or is that how sailors are? Like, you just, certain areas you just know, or you can see it. The sailors can see it.
Yeah. Well, you picked up on another really fascinating telling point of the book. And basically, at the start of the book, he says something like, I have studied the sea as few men have. Yes. Okay. And that's a telling statement. And the fact is, it's true. And I've reread that part you just read time and again, and I finally came to the conclusion that Slocum was so in tune to the ocean and its currents and the effect of the wind and wind direction on currents that he could tell when he was in, a current, a major current. He knew. And that's just a remarkable thing. But I think he was as much fish as man, where he just had this natural. Well, he may have been born with something, but then through this study, he developed it, and he studied pilot charts, which were being made under the auspices of the U.S. Navy, starting in the early 1840s, and he had some of these things, and he pored over them, and these were compilations based on the observations of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ship captains. On January 5th, I was off this cape, and I noticed that the wind was for the next 4 days, it blew east-northeast at 12 to 14 knots, and the current was, and he just absorbed it all. And so yeah, I don't think it was BS. I think he knew where he was. And the only time in that whole book that there were 2 times that I could tell that he didn't really know where he was. And one of them was in this nightmare he had when he got out of the Strait of Magellan, and was being blown back around to the Atlantic Ocean, and he headed in for shore, and he almost lost the boat there because he turned a little too early. And this is discussed in the book. And the other time was on his way back in the Caribbean, and he thought he was lost, but he was exactly right where he thought he was, but he'd been fooled by a reflection of a far distant lighthouse, and he thought he was in breakers, and it was really the reflection of this light. And he said, oh, that's what it was. So it was only, as far as I could tell, he was lost, or he didn't know his exact position one time, and that was off Cape Horn.
Yeah. And that had those wee wall, or whatever those winds were.
Willowas.
Willowas.
The Willowas, yes, which are terrible winds that come down up mountains, and they have them in Alaska too.
I didn't even know those existed. Just
Oh yes, that's something that, if you're sailing in those parts, or today in Alaska, it's a lot closer. So yeah, if you're up there, you're very well aware of.
yeah.
So we are a few minutes late. We should have made this longer, this part of it longer, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We told them we would be done by 7:45 for the second session. That will be more of a discussion. So I first just want to thank Stan for coming and joining us today. And Corey and I were talking earlier. We're going to announce the next book in the Zoom meeting, but we were hoping that your book could be one of our upcoming books in the spring, and we could actually go to Poverty Point and try it again. So if you're up for joining us again, we'd love to pick your book and sort of do this again with you.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. And then just so everybody knows, there is an exhibit right now at the Whaling Museum on Joshua Slocum and his voyage. And so it's a good thing to check out. They have a model of the spray. And so definitely go into, I think it's actually was done in connection with Stan's book, which you can also find at the museum because they're one of the co-publishers. So you can go to the New Bedford Whaling Museum's bookshop, gift shop, and order the book there. Or we don't really like to say Amazon, but you can get it on Amazon. And I'm sure you'll be able to get it at Partners Village store soon too. So thank you, Stan. Thank you, Corey.
Thank you.
And
nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you too. And whoever wants to join us in the Zoom room for a little bit more informal chit chat and the announcement of the next book, just go into the email that you got and click on the Zoom link, and I will see you there in a little while. Stan, you're welcome too, but you don't have to join us, but we'd love to have you in there. And I know Corey's coming. So, yeah.
And a shout out
Oh
for
my gosh, the shout out. Yes. Oh my goodness. October 25th.
October 25th at the Drawing Room. Melissa's going to be there, but she'll be more of a participant. Anthe is hosting at her shop, the Drawing Room, a book club we're doing and a wine tasting. And the book we're doing is called Cork Dork. It's by Bianca Bosker. It is the best wine book I've ever read. It will change your life. I've read it numerous times. For anyone, if you're a foodie, if you love to know about the science of how your body works, if you love literature, philosophy, I mean, this book has it all. Cutting edge science, history, and Bianca Bosker, she's very similar with her writing style when it comes to deconstructing science in a similar way that Mary Roach is, if any of you have heard of her. And I emailed Bianca Bosker just because why not? And she is going to join us for some time. This will be this coming Sunday, October 25th, 3 to 5 o'clock or 5-ish. And you can go on Anthe's website. She's got a little tasting package for wines we're going to do. Even if you've not read the book, tune in and join us. And this could be kind of a teaser for the book. So that's all.
Bianca knows wines like Joshua Slocum knows the sea.
Oh, yes, that's so good. That is so good.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks, Stan.
Thank you, Stan.